Dang, made for this.
Do you hear that? Trish, stop. There's like snapping twigs.
It's like we have a couple bears here.
Jane Kilcher finally broke her silence after years of fan speculation, and what she revealed turned everything upside down. For the longest time, most viewers believed Alaska, the last frontier, showed the full truth, that Jane and the Kilcher family were living raw, off-grid lives, powered only by grit and survival. That's what made people fall in love with the show. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if Jane had been quietly hiding emotional pain, legal drama, and a crumbling marriage, all while the cameras kept rolling? I've watched every episode, dug through interviews, and pieced together the real timeline from start to finish. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the full truth about Jane Kilcher's life, reveal what the show didn't want you to see, and explain why her final decision changed everything. Jane Kilcher didn't just break her silence, she shattered it. After years of whispers and wild theories, she finally told the truth about everything. For over a decade, fans watched Jane Kilcher navigate the icy waters of Alaska on their TV screens, wondering what was really going on behind that fearless smile. People speculated endlessly. Was she really as tough as she looked? Was her marriage falling apart? Was the show hiding something big? The rumors only got louder after Alaska. The last frontier ended, but then out of nowhere, Jane spoke up, and what she revealed was more raw and emotional than anyone expected. But here's where it gets interesting. She didn't just clear up the gossip. She confirmed that some of the hardest moments of her life were completely hidden from the cameras. She opened up about private battles no one saw on screen. From her marriage struggles to the emotional weight she carried, while the spotlight focused mostly on the men, Jane shared the parts of her story that were kept off TV, and the reason will surprise you. Jane said she stayed quiet for years to protect her family, to keep her daughter out of the public eye, to hold her marriage together. But now that she's found her voice, she's not afraid to tell her side. Stick with me, because this next part explains how Jane's wild Alaska upbringing shaped everything she became. Before she ever appeared on television, Jane Kilcher was already living a story most people wouldn't survive. And it all started deep in the wilds of Alaska. Born in Anchorage in 1974, Jane wasn't raised with city comforts. Instead, she learned early how to fight against the cold, respect the land, and rely on no one but herself. While other kids were playing video games or watching cartoons, Jane was out in the snow, learning how to fish, chop wood, and track the seasons. Her parents didn't just raise her, they trained her to live, and those lessons didn't fade. They became the backbone of everything she later did. But that's just the beginning. Each summer, while others took vacations, Jane spent hours by the river, reeling in fish that would feed her family through the long winters. King salmon, halibut, red cod, you name it, Jane could catch it. And if she didn't, her family didn't eat. That kind of pressure would break most kids. For Jane, it built strength. Here's where it gets even crazier. By the time she was a teenager, Jane could outfish grown men and outlast brutal storms. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving in a place where survival itself is a full-time job. Keep watching, because the next twist in Jane's journey involves love, heartbreak, and a new chapter that changed her life forever. Jane didn't go looking for love in the Alaskan wilderness, but somehow, it found her anyway, and what followed was both beautiful and heartbreaking. At just 12 years old, Jane's family moved from the city of Anchorage to the small town of Homer. That's where she met Kilcher, a boy living just 11 miles away on another homestead. Back then, they were just kids, but life had a funny way of bringing them back together years later. In between, Jane had taken a different path. She got married to another man, had a daughter named Piper, and tried to build a life that made sense. But something never felt right. She wanted more than just comfort. She craved meaning, connection, and the kind of life that felt rooted in nature. But listen to this. After her first marriage ended, fate stepped in. Jane and reconnected, and this time, it was different. Their bond was deeper, built on shared values and a love for the land. In 2006, they tied the knot in a remote place called Head of the Bay. It was quiet, beautiful, and wild, just like their love story. Here's why that matters. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, and it took work. They built a life together, one filled with fishing trips, tough winters, and raising a blended family off the grid. But the homestead would soon test them in ways they never expected. Don't scroll yet. The next part reveals how Jane became a star, and what the cameras didn't show when things got tough. When the cameras showed up, Jane Kilcher didn't just step into the spotlight, she lit it up. But behind the smiles, something important was missing. Jane quickly became a fan favorite on Alaska, the last frontier. She wasn't afraid to fish in freezing waters, split wood in the snow, or crack jokes in the middle of a storm. Viewers loved her strength and humor. But while the show often focused on the daring adventures of Lee and his father, Jane's work mostly stayed in the background. She was the one making sure the family had food, managing the homestead, and holding everything together while the men were off facing bears or building cabins. But here's where it gets frustrating. Jane's courage wasn't loud, it was quiet, consistent, and constant. She dealt with the same bitter cold, isolation, and endless work, but she rarely got the spotlight. While her husband's heroics got full episodes, Jane's role often got trimmed to a few quick scenes. And the reason this is happening isn't just about editing, it's about how stories are told on TV. The producers wanted drama, danger, and action. Jane was offering something else: emotional strength, reliability, and heart. But fans started to notice. They saw past the edits and began to realize Jane was more than just the supporting wife. She was the glue. Stick with me, because what happened next pulled Jane into a controversy that could have ended everything. Everything was going fine, until one decision nearly brought the whole Kilcher family crashing down. In 2015, a shocking headline hit the news. Jane, Lee, and a production team from the show were accused of using a helicopter to hunt bears. In Alaska, that's a serious crime. Using aircraft for hunting isn't just frowned upon, it's illegal. The story blew up fast. Suddenly, the Kilchers weren't just reality TV stars. They were at the center of a legal storm, facing questions from the public, the press, and the courts. But here's the twist. The accusations turned out to be false. After months of stress and damage to their reputation, the charges were dropped. The Kilchers were cleared. Still, the damage had already been done. People started looking at them differently, and for Jane it was especially painful. She hadn't even been the one flying, but her name was still dragged through the mud. And that's not all. This controversy showed Jane something she hadn't fully realized. Being on a reality show meant giving up control over her story. Anyone could say anything, and the cameras would keep rolling. She started to see that fame had a price, and her family was the one paying it. Hold that thought, because the fallout from this moment didn't just hurt their public image. It cracked the foundation of something much more personal: Jane's marriage. One slip on a hiking trail changed everything, not just for Lee, but for Jane too. It was supposed to be a simple outing. In 2015, Lee went hiking with a friend in a place called Otter Cove. The cliffs there are steep, the ground unstable, and one wrong step can mean disaster. That's exactly what happened. Lee lost his footing and fell off a cliff. The injuries were brutal: a broken arm, a shattered hip, crushed ribs, punctured lungs. It was a miracle he survived at all. But that's just the surface. What came after the fall was even harder. Lee was no longer the strong, independent man Jane had built a life with. Now, he was in pain, stuck in a hospital bed, and struggling with the loss of control. Jane, meanwhile, had to take over everything. She became his nurse, his support system, and the only thing keeping their family going. And here's where it gets even more intense. Jane wasn't just dealing with chores and kids. She was carrying the emotional weight of a crumbling marriage. Lee couldn't handle needing help. Jane felt invisible and overwhelmed. The strong partnership they once had started to fade. The cameras kept rolling, but behind the scenes, their connection was falling apart. Keep watching, because this next part reveals the moment Jane knew it was time to walk away from more than just the show. After years of holding it all together, Jane Kilcher made the hardest decision of her life. She walked away. By 2019, the cracks in her marriage were too deep to ignore. The love that once brought her and Lee together had slowly turned into silence, confusion, and sadness. Jane had spent years as the backbone of their homestead, the caretaker during Lee's recovery, and the emotional anchor for their family. But she couldn't carry it all anymore. Behind the brave face, she was exhausted. The cameras showed a couple working side by side, but Jane knew the truth. The marriage wasn't working, and hadn't been for a long time. But listen to this. She didn't just leave for herself. She left because she knew staying would only make things worse. She wanted to protect her daughter, her peace, and whatever was left of her identity beyond the show. In 2023, after years of rumors and speculation, Jane confirmed what many fans feared. She and Lee had separated. It was a quiet, painful ending to a long chapter, and here's why that matters. Jane's announcement wasn't just about a breakup. It was a declaration that her story wasn't over, that she was ready to stop surviving and start living. It was her moment to step out of the shadows and finally put herself first. Stick around, because what Jane did next took everyone by surprise. Most people would disappear after a public breakup. Not Jane Kilcher. She jumped into something even tougher and riskier. After stepping away from Alaska, the last frontier, Jane could have faded quietly into the background. But that's not who she is. Instead of slowing down, she signed on to a new show, Bearing Sea Gold. It was nothing like the homestead life she had known. This time, Jane traded the forest for freezing ocean waters, battling strong currents, dangerous machinery, and brutal cold to mine for gold. It wasn't about fame. It was about starting fresh and pushing herself in ways she never had before. And that's just the beginning. Jane didn't show up as a side character. She dove in, literally, wearing heavy diving gear, working long days in rough waters. She proved once again that she wasn't afraid of hard work. This wasn't just survival, it was transformation. Viewers who thought they knew Jane saw a whole new side of her, fearless, determined, and ready to carve out a life on her own terms. But here's the twist. This new chapter wasn't just physical, it was emotional. For the first time, Jane wasn't defined by a marriage or a family name. She was standing alone and stronger than ever. And fans, they loved it. They didn't see a woman who had been broken. They saw someone who had rebuilt herself. Keep watching, because the truth about the show that made her famous is more staged than you think. What if the life you saw on TV wasn't the whole truth? Jane Kilcher lived it, and now we know what really went on behind the scenes. For years, Alaska, the last frontier, looked like raw, real survival. A family battling nature with nothing but grit and love. But Jane finally confirmed what many suspected. Not everything you saw was as wild or isolated as it seemed. The Kilchers live on a stunning 600-acre homestead, but it's just a short drive from the town of Homer, complete with grocery stores, schools, even a hospital. In other words, help was never far away. But here's where it gets even more revealing. While the show wasn't scripted, scenes were often set up to create drama. Small tasks were filmed to look like life or death challenges. Producers focused on danger, tension, and struggle, even if real life was more about quiet routines and teamwork. And Jane, she saw it all unfold from the inside. She played along at times, but she also chose to keep certain things private, like her kids. While fans always asked about them, Jane made a firm choice to keep her children off camera. She wanted to protect them from the pressures of fame and let them grow up without the weight of a reality show following them. Stick with me, because this last part reveals something even longtime fans never saw coming. Jane Kilcher may have walked away from the cameras, but she didn't walk away from her story. In fact, her real journey was only just beginning. After everything she endured, from a tough childhood in Alaska to a public breakup and the weight of reality TV, Jane found something few people ever do: freedom. Not just from a show or a relationship, but from expectations. She stopped trying to fit into a mold and started living for herself. No longer just Atsley's wife or the funny one on the homestead. Jane carved out a new identity, on her terms. But here's what makes it all so powerful. Jane didn't fade into bitterness or regret. Instead, she leaned into her strength. She kept her private life close, her family protected, and her head held high. And even though she's no longer on Alaska, the last frontier, her presence is still felt. Fans continue to follow her journey, cheering her on as she writes the next chapter of her life. One that's filled with risk, resilience, and reinvention. And the reason this matters is simple. Jane's story proves that no matter how wild life gets or how hard things fall apart, you can still rise. You can start over. You can be more than the role someone cast you in. Keep watching, because if there's one thing Jane Kilcher taught us, it's that strength comes quietly. And sometimes the biggest frontier to conquer is the one inside yourself.